My name is Harold Winslow, and I am 82 years old. For the past 6 years, I have lived alone in the house my late wife Edna and I bought more than 4 decades ago in Guilford, Connecticut. The house is a modest colonial with ivy creeping up one side and creaky wooden steps that sag a little under the weight of time. Like everything else in my life, I don't drive anymore, but I keep my car keys hanging by the door, mostly out of habit, as if pretending I could still pick them up and go somewhere gave me some illusion of control. Most days I wake up at 6:30, take 2 pills for my heart and 1 for blood pressure, make tea in the chipped porcelain kettle Edna brought back from Vermont in the 70s, and sit in the sunroom reading books I already know by heart. I was once a professor of literature at the local college, and though I retired 20 years ago, I still find myself quoting lines from Shakespeare and Melville under my breath, as if they might anchor me to something solid. Since Edna died, the house has become both sanctuary and prison. Some mornings, when the light hits the curtains just right, I almost think she's still here. I hear a creak in the hallway and imagine it's her footfall. I catch a whiff of the lavender perfume she wore, the kind I once grumbled about buying in bulk, and now I would give anything just to smell again. She passed away in her sleep. I found her that morning with her hands folded peacefully on her chest, like she had simply decided she'd done enough. It was the kind of death people say they want, but it felt like a theft to me. Quiet, clinical, far too sudden. The silence in the house after that wasn't the comforting kind. It was a void that swallowed noise. The refrigerator hum sounded like thunder. The ticking clock in the living room became unbearable, counting time I didn't want. My daughter Rebecca lives in Hartford with her husband Craig. We used to be close, back when she was young, and still called me Daddy, without irony. She was the kind of child who brought home crayon drawings of our family and insisted I hang them on the fridge, who demanded bedtime stories even when she was 10. Edna and I poured everything into raising her. Savings, energy, belief in the future. She was bright, ambitious, and restless, and we were proud. When she went off to college, I cried in the driveway as we waved her off. That was the last time I remember feeling truly needed by her. She changed after Craig came into her life. He was smooth, always too smooth, the kind of man who smiles without warmth and listens just enough to pretend he cares. I never trusted him, though I tried for Rebecca's sake. I tried harder after the twins were born, 2 boys, Jared and Mason, but they moved farther away emotionally even as they remained physically close. In the past decade, Rebecca has visited no more than twice a year. Craig, never. The boys came once for a brief Thanksgiving when they were 12, already bored by anything that didn't involve their phones. Our last real family dinner ended with Jared asking me if I had Wi-Fi. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but his flat expression told me otherwise. That night, they left early, claiming homework and schedules. They didn't hug me goodbye. Rebecca said they were tired, that I shouldn't take it personally. But how else was I supposed to take it? Every so often, Rebecca calls, usually to ask if I need groceries or if I've considered simplifying my living arrangements. That's code for assisted living. She says it gently, like it's a suggestion, but her tone implies it's inevitable. I always decline, saying I like my independence. She always sighs, tells me I'm being stubborn, reminds me that her friend's mother loves her retirement community. I nod, though she can't see me, and we change the subject. In truth, I do feel the years catching up. My knees creak when I climb the stairs, my hands tremble when I butter toast, and sometimes I forget why I walked into a room. But I still know who I am. I still read the paper every morning and do the crossword without cheating. I still remember the names of every student I ever taught, even the ones who hated Moby Dick. I still speak to Edna when no one's around, not because I believe she can hear me, but because it makes the silence feel less cruel. There's a neighbor boy, 15 or 16, who sometimes mows my lawn for a few bucks. I give him extra if he helps carry in groceries. He doesn't talk much, and I don't pry. We have an unspoken agreement. He helps without asking questions, and I don't treat him like a charity case. His name is Lucas, I think. Or maybe it's Liam. I wrote it down somewhere. It's getting harder to remember details like that. Sometimes I find my glasses in the fridge or forget whether I've eaten lunch. These are the things Rebecca latches onto when she makes her case for the nursing home. She thinks I don't notice, but I do. Every time she visits, she walks through the house like an appraiser, her eyes scanning the walls, the furniture, the floors. Last time she was here, she asked if I had a will. I told her yes, though I hadn't looked at it in years. She sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "Dad, we should talk about the future." I said, "Rebecca, I'm already living in it." She didn't laugh. Instead, she pulled out a brochure from her purse, glossy, thick paper, photos of smiling seniors playing cards and taking walks in manicured courtyards. "They have excellent facilities," she said. "Medical care, activities, meal plans. It's safe. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." I looked at the pictures, trying not to show the contempt rising in me. Everyone looked so happy, so clean, so managed. "I already don't worry about anything," I said, "except you putting me in a place where no one knows who I am." She flinched at that. For a moment, I thought she might cry. But Craig walked in and changed the subject. He said they'd been thinking about what to do with the house, how to make things easier for everyone. I told them the house wasn't a burden. Craig smiled and said, "It's not just about you anymore, Harold. It's about family." The way he said it made it clear he didn't consider me part of that equation, just an obstacle to manage. That night, I sat alone in the sunroom, the brochure still on the table. Edna would have laughed at the idea of me in a retirement community. She used to joke that if I ever got put in one, I'd start a rebellion. "You'd organize a book club and accidentally stage a coup," she'd said. I miss her laughter. I miss her grounding presence. She was the only person who could tell me I was being foolish without making me feel small. Without her, the world feels less navigable, and people like Craig feel more dangerous. There's a creeping suspicion I can't shake, something about their eagerness, their insistence that it's for my own good. Something about the way Craig looked at my bookshelf like it was already junk. I may be old. I may be forgetful, but I am not naive. I see the way Rebecca averts her eyes when I mention Edna. I see how Craig calculates everything like a transaction. I feel it in my bones. They want this house. They want my life reduced to a tidy room with beige walls and 3 scheduled meals a day. They want me out. And yet part of me still clings to hope. Hope that I'm wrong. That Rebecca is just overwhelmed. That she still sees me as her father, not as a piece of property to manage. But each day, that hope fades a little more. Each day, I sit in the sunroom, watching the light shift across the walls Edna once painted herself, and I wonder how long I can stay before they decide I don't belong here anymore. I wonder how long I have before they try to move me, not out of love, but out of calculation. And when that day comes, and I feel it coming, I don't know if I'll have the strength to fight back. Or maybe I do. Maybe there's one last rebellion left in me. It was a gray Wednesday afternoon, the kind that felt like it was suspended between seasons, when Rebecca and Craig arrived unannounced. I had just finished sweeping the porch, an effort that left my knees aching and my back tight, when I saw their silver Lexus creeping up the driveway like a quiet warning. They hadn't called ahead, and something about the suddenness of their visit made my stomach clench with unease. Craig stepped out first, dressed as always in a pressed shirt and loafers without socks, while Rebecca followed, clutching a folder to her chest, as if it contained the instructions for my life. Her smile was too bright, her greeting too chipper, the kind of artificial cheerfulness people adopt when they're about to do something they know you won't like. I invited them in, offered tea, which they both declined. That alone told me something was off. Craig never passed on a free cup of my Assam, especially not in winter. They sat me down in the living room, each of them perched on the edge of their respective armchairs like they were waiting to be called into a job interview. Rebecca opened the folder and with an overly rehearsed calmness said, "Dad, we've been thinking a lot about how to help you in the next stage of your life." I didn't answer, just looked at her and waited. She took that as permission to continue. We found this incredible place, not far from here. It's called Brookshire Manor. They specialize in assisted living, but it's more like a resort. Really beautiful, with full-time staff, on-site doctors, activities, a library, even a little garden area for the residents. You'd have your own room, of course, your own space. It's not a nursing home, not in the traditional sense. It's more like, well, a lifestyle upgrade. She pushed a glossy brochure into my hands. The paper was thick, the kind used for wedding invitations and expensive catalogs. The front cover showed a white-haired man smiling beside a lake, with a golden retriever at his feet and a group of seniors playing bocce ball in the background. The image made me feel hollow. I flipped through the pages slowly. Everything was manicured, pre-approved, curated for peace and predictability. There was no space for silence that meant something, no room for the creak of a familiar floorboard or the smell of decades of shared life in old wooden walls. "You want me to live here?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Craig leaned forward then, always the salesman when there was something to win. "It's not about what we want, Harold. It's about what's best. Your health, your safety, your comfort. This house, it's too much for you. All those stairs, the maintenance, the cold in winter, you deserve better." Rebecca nodded quickly, her eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of forced warmth and subtle pressure. "Dad, please don't take this the wrong way. We're doing this because we care. We just want to be proactive. Last week you told me you'd misplaced your keys for 3 days. What if it had been something more serious? What if you had fallen? We wouldn't have known." That was true. I had lost the keys. But I had found them again, under the newspaper on the dining table. A momentary lapse, not a sign of decay. Still, they latched onto these moments like they were collecting evidence. "And besides," she continued, "Brookshire has on-site emergency care. You wouldn't be alone. You'd be surrounded by people, friends. You're so isolated here." I folded the brochure shut, placed it carefully on the table, and took a long breath. "Have you already reserved a spot?" Rebecca glanced at Craig, who answered, "There's a deposit down. It's refundable for 30 days. That was all I needed to hear. So this wasn't a conversation, it's a presentation. Craig shifted in his seat but said nothing. Rebecca reached out to touch my hand, a gesture I once would have found comforting, but now felt strategic. "Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to help. You should be thanking us." The words landed like a slap. Thanking them? For planning to remove me from the house I'd built my life in? For deciding my fate behind my back? For reducing me to a brochure and a line item on a spreadsheet? I looked at her hand on mine and gently moved it away. "Help," I said quietly, "is when you ask what someone needs, not when you decide for them." Rebecca's face stiffened, but Craig barreled forward. "Look, we're not trying to fight with you. But the house is already listed. We've had a few showings." I froze. "What do you mean, listed?" "With a realtor?" Rebecca said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "Just to see, nothing's final. But if the right offer comes..." "You listed my house without asking me?" "You're not hearing us," she said, her voice now laced with irritation. "You can't manage this place forever. It's not safe, and we're trying to be responsible." "You're trying to get rid of me," I said, the calm in my voice more dangerous than anger. "No," she snapped. "We're trying to preserve what matters." "You're not going to live forever, Dad, and when that day comes, we'll be the ones left to deal with everything. You should be grateful we're planning ahead." I stood up slowly, because the ache in my knees reminded me of my age in ways my daughter never could. "I think you should go," I said. "We're just trying to—" Craig started, but I raised my hand. "Go." They left in silence, and I didn't walk them out. When the door clicked shut behind them, I didn't move for a long time. The brochure was still on the table, a grotesque reminder of how easily a life could be reduced to bullet points and selling features. I walked over, picked it up, and dropped it into the fireplace. I watched the smiling man and his golden retriever curl into ash. Later that night, I opened the cabinet where Edna had kept our important papers and found the deed to the house. Her name and mine, side by side. I traced her signature with my finger, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to clarity. They thought I would go quietly. They thought I would pack a suitcase, nod politely, and fade away into a pastel-colored room filled with soft music and strangers. But they underestimated the strength of memory, of roots, of someone who had already lost the most precious part of his world and wasn't about to lose what remained. They thought I should thank them for a nursing home bed. But in that moment, I decided I would take their bedroom instead. The days that followed their visit blurred into a strange, tense suspension of time, as if my home had been knocked slightly off its foundation, not physically, but spiritually. Every creak of the floorboards, every familiar shadow that once comforted now made me feel like an intruder in my own space, as if it no longer belonged entirely to me. I tried to resume my usual routines: tea in the morning, quiet hours with my books, a walk around the yard, but I found myself distracted, agitated, replaying every word of that conversation over and over. "You should be thanking us," Rebecca had said, and that line echoed through the walls like an insult tattooed on the air. I had not called them since, and they had not called me either, which was a silence more revealing than any argument could have been. They were waiting for me to surrender. But surrender was not a skill I had ever developed. Not when I was growing up in a household where survival meant reading the moods of an alcoholic father. Not in my career where I defended Shakespeare to rooms of students who'd rather be anywhere else, and certainly not now. Not when the ghosts of everything I had built were still alive in these walls. A week passed before Rebecca returned. She arrived alone this time, wearing the smile of someone who thinks they're offering a lifeline when in fact they're holding a leash. She brought groceries, which I didn't ask for, and avoided eye contact as she placed items into my refrigerator, with the practiced motions of someone ticking off a task rather than performing an act of kindness. "I thought you might need a few things," she said, placing a carton of milk and a loaf of whole wheat bread on the counter. "You like this kind, right?" It wasn't a question, and I didn't answer. Instead, I watched her scan the kitchen, her gaze lingering a bit too long on the worn linoleum, the dusty corners. "Dad," she began, and I braced myself. "I know you're upset, but please understand Craig and we're not trying to hurt you. We just don't want to see you struggle." I told her plainly that I wasn't struggling. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile people wear when they're trying not to call someone delusional. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and slid it across to me. It displayed a real estate listing, my house, in full-color photos, staged with different furniture, my furniture absent, replaced with soulless beige chairs and abstract art. "We've had offers," she said. "Good ones, People are interested. It would make things easier. For whom? I asked. For everyone, she answered too quickly. And besides, Brookshire is ready. They've been holding the room. That word, room, hit me harder than it should have. Not home, room, a rental in a sanitized complex, a bed, a closet, a bathroom. That was the life they were carving out for me. I haven't agreed to any of this, I said slowly. Rebecca's expression flickered, just for a second, from composed to irritated, and then back. You're being difficult, she said. Don't make us force your hand. That night, I sat in Edna's old reading chair, the one she used to curl up in with a blanket and a book, and tried to remember the last time Rebecca had come to this house, just to sit and talk. Not to rearrange my life or push an agenda. I couldn't recall a single instance in the past 5 years. The house felt altered now. Not physically, but spiritually occupied. I went to the study and opened the desk drawer where I kept important papers. Inside, among tax returns and old letters, I found a sealed envelope in Edna's handwriting, marked simply, "In case." My hands shook slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter, brief and written in her neat, looping script. Harold, if you are reading this, then something is happening I feared might come. Be cautious. Rebecca means well, but she listens to Craig too much. Protect yourself. Protect what we built. This house has you in its walls. Don't let it go easily. I stared at those words for a long time, overwhelmed not just by the content, but by the validation. Edna had seen it too. She had felt it. The slow erosion of loyalty, the creeping corrosion of family into business. The next morning I called my lawyer, Gerald Hunt, a quiet man in his 70s, who had handled our affairs for years. He agreed to meet with me the following afternoon. I took the bus into town, something I hadn't done in ages, and it felt strange to be among people who didn't know me, didn't look at me like a problem to be solved. Gerald greeted me warmly, ushered me into his office, and offered me coffee. We sat down, and I laid everything out. What Rebecca and Craig had said, the listing of the house, the deposit at Brookshire. Can they do this without your consent? Gerald asked, flipping through the deed I had brought. No, not legally. Your name is on the title. Both you and Edna held joint ownership, and upon her death, the property passed fully to you. No one can sell it without your signature. I felt a weight lift from my chest. However, Gerald added, if they claim you're mentally incompetent, if they produce medical evaluations or file for guardianship, it could become complicated. I understood then just how deep this went. They weren't just pushing me out. They were building a legal narrative, one that painted me as forgetful, incapable, vulnerable. I had to act, not just emotionally, but strategically. That evening, I started making calls. First to my old colleague Thomas Greaves, a retired doctor who once ran the geriatric unit at Yale. He agreed to schedule a cognitive assessment. Just routine, I said. For peace of mind. I scheduled the tests for the following week. Then I called the bank and asked to set restrictions on joint account access, especially to any account Rebecca might know about. I could hear the gears turning in my head for the first time in years, not the creaking of age, but the quiet, methodical ticking of someone planning a defense. This was no longer just about staying in my home. It was about reclaiming my agency. 2 days later, I came home from the pharmacy to find Craig in my living room. He was sitting on my sofa, legs crossed, scrolling through something on his phone. The audacity of it startled me. Door was open, he said casually, as if that justified anything. I thought I'd stop by, make sure you're doing okay. I didn't answer. We're really doing this for you, Harold. Brookshire is a good place. You'll have companionship, security. This old place, it's sentimental, but it's not sustainable. You've had a good run. I stood there silently, the keys to my house still in my hand, and I realized I was looking not at a son-in-law, but at a man who saw me as a liability. "I want you out of my house," I said. "Now." Craig stood up slowly. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Do you know what the market is doing right now? This place could sell for over $500,000. You could live off that money for the rest of your life." "I already am," I replied. "And when I'm gone, it won't be you I leave it to." That got his attention. For the first time, I saw something real flash across his face. Not anger, but fear. He left without another word, and I locked the door behind him. Then I walked through the house, room by room, whispering to the walls like Edna used to when she cleaned. "I'm still here," I said. "You're still mine." That night, I barely slept. I sat at the window watching the moon shift behind clouds, and I understood. This wasn't the beginning of the end. This was a battle. And I wasn't done fighting. Not yet. One evening, about a week after Craig's unsolicited visit, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, but something told me to answer. The voice on the other end was soft, unsure at first, then steadier. "Grandpa, it's Noah." It took me a second to respond. Noah, my grandson, Rebecca's son, whom I hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 years, not since he went off to college in Vermont. "Noah," I said, the syllables foreign on my tongue but warm in my chest. "You're calling me?" There was a pause, then a quiet, "I heard what Mom and Craig are doing. I didn't know the whole story until last night." "I'm sorry." His voice cracked slightly, and I could hear genuine remorse beneath it. "They said you were having memory problems, that you wanted to move, that you asked them to help sell the house, but I didn't believe it. Not after everything." I sat down at the kitchen table, gripping the phone like it was the only thing tethering me to the present. "Noah," I said again, "you don't know how much this means to me, just hearing your voice. I miss you, Grandpa. I really do, and I want to help if I can." He explained that he had come home for spring break and found the Brookshire paperwork on his parents' kitchen counter, along with documents about the house listing, legal forms with my name already signed, except they weren't signed by me. "The signatures look off. I compared them to the letters you used to send me. They don't match." I felt my pulse quicken. Forged. They had forged my name. "I took photos of everything," Noah added. "I wasn't sure what to do with them. But if you need them—" "I do," I said, my voice low but certain. "I absolutely do." The next morning, I met with Gerald again and showed him the pictures Noah had sent. Gerald studied them closely, then leaned back in his chair with a long sigh. "This is serious," he said. "If these signatures were used in any official capacity, real estate documents, medical releases, financial transactions, that's fraud. Criminal fraud." The word felt like a stone dropped into a still pond. "What do I do?" I asked. "We document everything," Gerald said. "We start building a case. But first, I'd recommend we get a forensic handwriting analyst to verify these are forgeries." By the end of the day, we had a plan. Submit the documents for handwriting analysis. Initiate a cease and desist letter to the real estate agent handling my home, and prepare to challenge any further attempts to declare me incapacitated. It felt like a war council, only quieter, older, more bureaucratic, but just as urgent. Later that week, I went for my cognitive evaluation with Dr. Greaves. It took nearly 3 hours. Memory tests, logic puzzles, reaction assessments. At the end, he looked me squarely in the eye and said, "You're sharper than half the board members I worked with. Your memory's intact. Your cognition is clear. There's no evidence of decline beyond normal aging." He signed the report immediately and handed me a copy. "Use this," he said, "and don't let anyone tell you who you are." I thanked him and walked out into the cool March afternoon feeling more seen than I had in years. With that paper in hand, I felt like I was walking back into my own skin. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about Edna, remembering the last real conversation we had before she passed. We'd sat in the sunroom, drinking tea as a storm rolled in outside, and she'd said something I hadn't understood then. People think storms come to destroy things, but sometimes they come to uncover what's been rotting beneath. I see it now, Edna. The rot was there all along. I just didn't want to see it. I wanted to believe Rebecca was still my daughter in the way she had been at 12, not the cold, careful woman she had become. And Craig? I should have trusted my instincts. There was always something calculated in his gaze, something hungry behind his charm. The next morning, Gerald called. "We've got confirmation," he said. "The handwriting analysis confirms your signature was forged, twice. Once on the listing agreement, once on the medical release." I closed my eyes, absorbing it. It was no longer just a suspicion. It was fact. They had tried to erase me, legally, logistically, even emotionally, but they hadn't accounted for Noah. They hadn't accounted for the part of me that still had fight left. By the end of the week, the cease and desist had been delivered to the realtor, who promptly pulled the listing offline and emailed Craig to inform him that the sale was halted pending legal clarification. I imagined his face when he read it. I imagined the sputtered indignation, the blaming of Rebecca, the frantic pacing. And for once, I smiled. The battlefield had shifted. The old man they thought they could tuck into a nursing home had not only resisted, he had counterattacked. But this wasn't revenge, not yet. This was the moment I stopped defending my life and started reclaiming it. This was the pivot, the line drawn in stone, not sand. This was war. The days following the forensic confirmation passed in a flurry of hushed legal exchanges, notarized declarations, and emails traded between Gerald and an increasingly agitated legal representative from Craig's side. What had begun as a series of passive, veiled suggestions had now escalated into formal accusations, countermeasures, and strategic positioning. I spent most of those days by the phone or staring out the window, watching the skeletal branches of the maple trees shudder in the late March wind. The weather was turning warmer, but there was still a brittleness in the air, as if the thaw came reluctantly, suspicious of its own arrival. In the quiet moments, I found myself drifting to the past, not out of nostalgia, but as a form of reckoning. I revisited conversations with Rebecca, the shifts in her voice, die Schiffszitterbeut that had gone unnoticed, the subtle withdrawal of affection that I once wrote off as adulthood, busyness, the inevitable detachment that comes when children build lives of their own. But that wasn't what this was. This was not detachment. It was something colder, transactional. It was a daughter looking at her father as a ledger line, not a living man. And it had begun long before Brookshire entered the picture. The day after the real estate listing was pulled, I received a letter. It was printed on thick, expensive paper, watermarked with the logo of a prominent Hartford law firm. Rebecca and Craig had retained counsel. The letter was simultaneously condescending and threatening, a masterclass in corporate civility masking quiet menace. It stated that due to ongoing concerns about Mr. Harold Winslow's mental competency and well-being, the family intended to pursue emergency guardianship proceedings unless I voluntarily agreed to relocate to a supervised care facility. They had included, as part of their evidence, statements from 2 medical professionals, neither of whom had ever met me, who had allegedly reviewed family-provided documentation and secondhand accounts of memory lapses, disorientation, and behavioral changes. It was fiction, dressed in lab coats and legalese, but I saw their play. If they couldn't get me to agree, they'd try to have me removed by force. I sat in my study holding that letter, the late afternoon sun slicing through the blinds in golden stripes, and something hardened in me. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a cold clarity, the kind that comes not from courage, but from the extinguishing of illusion. They had decided who I was, and in doing so, they had forfeited the right to know who I really was. I called Gerald immediately, and by the next morning, we had begun assembling my response. We countered their claims with documented evidence, the results from Dr. Greaves, the cognitive assessments, affidavits from 2 of my former colleagues who had visited recently and attested to my mental soundness, and, most damning of all, the report from the handwriting analyst. But we didn't stop there. With Noah's blessing, we also submitted the photographs of the forged documents he had found, along with a notarized statement from him detailing the circumstances of their discovery. It was an uncomfortable move, placing my grandson in the crossfire, but it was also the only way to expose the rot fully. And to his credit, Noah didn't flinch. The fallout was immediate. 2 days after the letter exchange, I received a call. Not from Rebecca, but from Craig. His voice was tight, tense, the forced politeness stripped away like old paint. "Harold," he said. "Not Dad. Never Dad. This is all getting out of hand. There's no need to escalate this into something ugly. Let's sit down like adults and work something out." I told him I'd consider it. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I wanted him to stew in uncertainty. That same afternoon, Gerald advised me that if we wanted to protect my property rights fully, the best course would be to file a preemptive injunction preventing any transfer or sale of the house, without my explicit written consent. I agreed. Within 48 hours, the court had issued a temporary order, effectively freezing any potential tampering. We also filed a civil complaint alleging attempted fraud, misrepresentation, and elder coercion. It was a strong case, Gerald said, and it was only the beginning. Word spread quickly in our quiet town. I began receiving odd phone calls from neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in years. Some expressed support. Others sounded cautious, curious, as though trying to sniff out scandal without asking directly. One afternoon, a woman I vaguely remembered from the church choir Edna used to lead dropped off a casserole saying she just wanted to check in. I thanked her, but didn't invite her in. I knew what she wanted: details. Everyone wanted details, and I wasn't in the business of providing them. Let them gossip. Let them fill in the blanks. The truth was already more unbelievable than anything they could invent. A week later, Rebecca showed up unannounced again. This time she was alone, and visibly shaken. She looked thinner, her eyes shadowed, her usually pristine blouse wrinkled. "Dad," she began, standing in the doorway like a penitent, "can we talk?" I let her in, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to see what kind of performance she'd rehearsed. She sat in the living room, hands clasped tightly, the way she used to when she was about to ask for money in college. "You're angry," she said. "I understand, and I deserve it. But I didn't know how to do this. Craig, he pushed a lot of this. I went along with it. I didn't think it would go this far." I watched her carefully, saying nothing. She continued, "We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to protect you. I've seen you forget things. I've seen how much the house overwhelms you. You saw what you wanted to see, I said, or what was convenient to see. But let's not pretend this was about my safety. This was about control, about inheritance, about getting what you thought you were owed, sooner rather than later. Her mouth tightened, but she didn't deny it. That was the most honest thing she'd done in years. Then she tried a different tactic. What about the boys? She asked. Jared and Mason? Do you want to die with them thinking you hated their mother? I stood up then, the rage beneath my skin like a rising tide. You don't get to invoke them, not after what you've done. And if they ever ask me what happened, I'll tell them the truth. Every ugly detail. She stood too, trembling slightly, and for a second, I thought she might cry. But then the mask slipped back into place. You think this is over, she said, but it's not. You can't fight forever. I don't need forever, I replied, just long enough. When she left, I locked the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the silence. It wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of a siege. And I was ready. That night, I drafted a letter to Noah, thanking him for his courage, for not becoming what his parents had. I didn't say I loved him, not because I didn't, but because the word felt too brittle under the weight of everything that had transpired. Instead, I said I trusted him. And that was, in some ways, more sacred. A few days later, Gerald called with news. The court had accepted our filings, and a preliminary hearing date had been set. They're rattled, he said. Their lawyers already made 2 overtures for a settlement. They want to avoid discovery. I told him I wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. I wanted exposure. I wanted every lie, every forged document, every backroom plan dragged into the light. That's going to get messy, he warned. I'm not afraid of mess, I replied. Not anymore. Spring crept in, soft and slow, as it always did in New England, and the garden Edna once tended began to stir. Crocuses pushed through frost-bitten soil, and the robins returned to the oak outside the study window, and through it all, I waited. For court dates, for phone calls, for the next move. Because if they thought they could take my home, my mind, my dignity, then they never really knew who I was. But now they were going to learn. The morning of the court hearing dawned with a dense fog settling low over the town, cloaking rooftops and street lamps in a pale, woolen hush. I rose early, dressed in my best navy blazer, one Edna had insisted I keep even after retirement, saying every man should have at least one jacket for when he needs to be taken seriously. I trimmed my beard, shined my shoes, and tucked into my briefcase the file Gerald had prepared. Dozens of neatly ordered documents that told a version of my life I never thought I'd have to defend. Outside, the streets were quiet, and the walk from the cab to the courthouse felt longer than it was, each step echoing like a deliberate refusal to be erased. Gerald met me on the steps, his gray wool coat flapping gently in the wind, and without saying much, we nodded to each other and entered the building, passing through metal detectors and marble hallways that smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. Courtroom B2 was nearly empty when we arrived, save for a clerk and the bailiff, and we took our seats at the table marked Respondent. Across the room, Rebecca sat flanked by her attorney and Craig, who wore a dark suit and a face devoid of expression. She looked tired, older than the last time I saw her, but she didn't look at me. When the judge entered, an imposing woman with sharp features and a voice that could slice granite, everyone stood, and the session began with formality that felt like theater, until the substance of the matter bled through the script. Rebecca's lawyer opened with practiced solemnity, painting a portrait of a concerned daughter forced to intervene out of love. She spoke of confusion, missed appointments, mismanaged medication, and isolation. She cited 2 declarations from out-of-state doctors who had never spoken to me, one of whom had reviewed observational notes allegedly submitted by Rebecca. It was a portrait of a man drifting, unaware of the danger he posed to himself, stubbornly clinging to independence while slipping into decline. It would have been compelling, perhaps even believable, had I not been sitting 10 feet away, listening with the clarity of a man who still solved crossword puzzles in ink. When it was Gerald's turn, he stood slowly, unhurried, the way you do when you know time is now your ally. He began not with law, but with character. My 40 years as a professor, my clean bill of health, my lucid evaluations from specialists who had sat across from me, looked me in the eye, and asked me questions that required thinking, not parroting. Then he laid out the evidence, the forged signatures, the misrepresented documents, the notarized statement from my grandson, and the sworn affidavit from Dr. Greaves. Each paper slid across the judge's bench like a blade. The air in the room thickened with something that felt like shifting balance. When Gerald finished, the judge leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, and said she would now hear directly from me. I stood, my legs stiff but steady, and walked slowly to the stand. The oath felt more intimate than ceremonial. When I spoke, I didn't argue or plead. I simply told the truth. I described my routines, the way I still managed my affairs, the things I still remembered. Not facts, but moments. The exact sound Edna made when she laughed at midnight television, the way the floors creaked near the hallway closet, the birthdays, cards I used to write to Rebecca by hand and mail even when she stopped replying. I said, "A man doesn't forget the life he's lived, he just learns to carry it differently." I told them I didn't fear death, or even dependence, but I feared being rewritten. I feared becoming a caricature, a liability to be managed, instead of a man to be respected. I said, "This isn't just about property or memory, it's about dignity. And once you strip a man of that, what's left of him doesn't belong to anyone." I looked at Rebecca finally and added, "I don't know when I stopped being your father and started being your burden, but I felt it. Every missed call, every conversation that ended too quickly, every visit that came with an agenda." The courtroom was silent. The judge thanked me, told me I could step down, and then recessed for an hour to review the documents in chambers. We waited in the hallway, Gerald reading through his notes again, though he didn't need to. I watched Craig pacing by the vending machines, and I saw for the first time the lines of worry in his forehead, the way he kept glancing at his phone as if waiting for an alternate ending to arrive via text. Rebecca sat alone on the bench, staring at the floor, her fingers laced together so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked like the girl I once carried on my shoulders through autumn leaves, the child who used to crawl into my lap to ask what dreams meant. But I felt no urge to comfort her. Not anymore. Not after what she had tried to take. When the judge returned, her tone was firm and final. She ruled in my favor, denying the guardianship petition and condemning the use of forged documents. She stated that the evidence demonstrated not concern, but a pattern of coercion and manipulation. The court recognized my continued legal capacity and affirmed my rights over the property. Additionally, she referred the matter of the forgeries to the district attorney for further review. It wasn't just a victory, it was vindication. The silence that followed her ruling was deafening. Rebecca didn't speak. Craig looked as if he'd swallowed a stone. Gerald shook my hand without flourish, but with something deeper. Respect. Outside the courthouse, the sun had finally burned through the fog, and the light felt sharper, as if the world had come into focus. Reporters waited, alerted no doubt by someone eager for scandal, but Gerald deflected them with a curt no comment. I walked down the steps slowly, savoring the feeling of weight being lifted. Not the physical weight, which still clung to my joints and bones, but the emotional heaviness that had pressed against my chest for weeks. I thought I might feel triumph, or rage, or even sorrow, but instead I felt peace. Not because justice had been served, but because the lie had been stopped before it became permanent. That night I returned home and walked through each room as if reintroducing myself to my own life. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt defended, claimed, mine. I sat in the sunroom as dusk settled in, a cup of tea growing cold beside me, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to cry, not from grief or fear or anger, but from the overwhelming relief of still being here, still whole, still seen. I wasn't a patient in waiting. I wasn't a memory fading. I was Harold Winslow, and I was not done. In the weeks after the hearing, life settled into a kind of quiet that I hadn't known in years, a silence not born of abandonment or loss, but of completion. The house, once heavy with tension and the unspoken threat of displacement, now felt lighter, not in the physical sense, but in the way a body feels after shedding an unbearable weight. The first few mornings, I half expected another letter, another surprise visit, some final twist of spite to claw its way through the door, but none came. The calls stopped. The emails ceased. Rebecca and Craig vanished like mist at dawn, and though I did not celebrate their absence, I did not mourn it either. What remained was mine, not just the house and the memories within it, but the hard-earned peace that only comes from standing up when you were expected to lie down. Noah visited the following weekend. He drove in from school without calling ahead, and when I opened the door and saw him standing there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unsure, I felt something catch in my throat. We didn't hug immediately. Instead, we stood looking at each other for a long moment as if assessing the new shape of our bond, no longer filtered through his mother's intentions or my silence. Then quietly, he stepped forward and embraced me, not with the awkwardness of a grandson fulfilling obligation, but with the firmness of a man who understood the cost of loyalty. We spent the afternoon walking the garden, though most of it was still recovering from winter. Noah asked questions, not just about the case, but about Edna, about the early years of the house, about the things he had never thought to ask when he was younger. And I answered all of them, honestly, not to rewrite history, but to share it while I still could. He said he was sorry for not being around more, for not seeing sooner what had been happening. I told him he had shown up exactly when he needed to, and that was more than most ever do. A few days later, I received a short envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Rebecca's handwriting. It was not a letter of apology. It did not explain or justify. It simply read, "I hope one day you understand why we did what we did, and I hope one day I can forgive myself." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in Edna's old jewelry box beside the letter she had left me. I did not respond. There was nothing to say. Some bridges once burned illuminate more than they connect. I made some changes around the house, small at first. I cleared out the upstairs guest room and moved into it. Not because I was banished from the master bedroom, but because I wanted a fresh start. A space that belonged to the present rather than the past. I kept Edna's room as it was, dusted and clean like a chapel of memory. But I no longer needed to sleep inside our history to feel close to it. I reshelved the books in my study, replaced some of the older kitchen fixtures, and even painted the front door a deep green, a color Edna had once admired, but never convinced me to try. It felt like a gesture of compromise between us, even now. On Sundays, I began attending the local library's senior book circle, not to make friends necessarily, but to speak out loud, to argue about literature again, to remember that my voice still mattered in rooms beyond my own. And sometimes when the afternoon sun hit the west windows just right, I would sit in the sunroom with a cup of tea and simply listen to the creak of the house settling around me, a sound no longer ominous, but familiar, ancestral. I was still here, still standing. I did not seek vengeance. I did not press criminal charges, though I could have. Gerald said the DA was interested, that there was enough for a case, but I declined to cooperate, not because I was merciful, but because some punishments are best delivered by time, by distance, by the absence of trust. Rebecca would carry what she had done far longer than any court sentence. That was enough for me. Some nights, when the wind is especially still, I think of Edna, not in grief, but in gratitude. She had seen what I refused to see. She had warned me gently, without blame. And her voice, preserved in ink and memory, had given me the courage to fight. In a way, this house became her final act of protection, and I, in defending it, honored that legacy not with revenge, but with resolve. I am 82 years old, and for the first time in many years, I do not feel forgotten. I do not feel surplus. I feel present. I feel awake. They said I should thank them for a nursing home bed. Instead, I took back my name, my space, my place, and I will die in this house, not out of pride, but out of love, because no one gets to rewrite the ending of a story they didn't help write, and mine, at last, is my own.